I've been involved in this Shakespeare authorship research. Okay.
Mhm.
And this is the way in my life that sort of philosophy showed me what's going on. It gave me a perspective to understand, I think, understand what's going on in ways that other people couldn't understand. Because I studied at, in a master's program, I studied mostly Hume, Kant, and philosophy of science. And when you study philosophy of science, you read Kuhn, you read these other philosophers, and you learn about how scientific theories develop and change,
Mm.
how, and it's another issue of perspective, right? I mean, they call it a
Mhm.
paradigm. Kuhn calls it a paradigm shift, but it's really just looking at the same data, the same information from a different perspective, and that giving you a better handle on it, right? So
Mhm.
you look at the famous example is you look at the motion of the planets, and then you think about what's going on, and Copernicus said, well, maybe the sun's in the center, and you're seeing the same data, you're seeing the same movement of the
Right.
planets, you're just looking at it from a different perspective. And does that new perspective help you or hurt you in understanding what's going on, right?
Mhm.
And so when I looked into the Shakespeare authorship question, who wrote the works of Shakespeare? This has
Mhm.
been a debate that's going on for 150 years at least. And so I started looking into it. And what was clear to me is that the philosophy of science told me what was going on here. Because Kuhn had the deep insight that a good theory is producing good research
Mm.
based on that theory. It's sort of creating a research program. And if
Okay.
Shakespeare wrote the works of Shakespeare, if that was a good theory, then when people studied Shakespeare's life
Mhm.
and they studied the works, they would reinforce each other. The more you
Mhm.
studied his life, the more you'd understand the works based upon that study,
Mhm.
if it was a correct theory.
Hmm.
But that hasn't been happening. In the last 100 years, studying Shakespeare's life doesn't produce anything in understanding the works. In fact, they don't even have a really theory or a clear narrative of how Shakespeare's life aligns with the composition of these works, right? He was
Okay.
involved in acting them. He was involved in the uh, part owner in the acting company that produced them, but actually composing them, there's
Mhm.
nothing that aligns, right?
Mhm.
So you
That's a
have
really interesting way to get at that. I mean, I've
right,
not heard it said this way. And when I was talking to someone about you and and that Shakespeare, I should say, in my head, it's anti-Shakespeare work.
right.
They were saying that, yeah, this isn't anything new. This is something that people have been bringing up and studying, researching for quite a while. But I think that that is quite a clear way of why it's something to question, and that we can apply that to all kinds of other things, that they should align. If we have this theory about Shakespeare or anything else, and then we look at Shakespeare or anything else, it should reinforce the theory, but or support it in some kind of way. And if it doesn't, then
Well, then we need to
let the
look for
questions
alternate
begin.
right, and we need to look for alternatives that might.
Hmm.
The problem is, and this is where the philosophy also is helpful, I think.
Hmm.
Most of the research done against Shakespeare, if we want to phrase it that way, has been really, really bad. So the
Okay.
anti-Shakespeare people
Uh-huh.
are worse than the Shakespeare people. So you have what I like to call a circular firing squad of wrong,
Oh
where
gosh.
the Shakespeare scholars are saying something that's probably not correct. And then
Mhm.
the anti Shakespeare people are coming up with theories that are even worse. So they're fighting with each other where they're both wrong.
Oh.
And one is more wrong than the other, kind of. I mean, it's like which part of wrong is less wrong, right?
Yeah.
So you've got this just mess of people fighting with each other about something where they're both just going at it the wrong way,
Hmm.
and they can't see it because they're so angry at the other guy that they can't
Hmm.
see what they're doing is completely the wrong direction. And there's nobody to come and step in and say, okay, let's stop for a second and see what's really going on here. And let's try to be, I hate to say rational about it, but at least methodical about it. Okay. And try to figure out how to handle this. But everybody also has their own self-interest and their own ego involved too, right?
Right.
And on top of that, they have their feeling like my view is somehow righteous.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Shakespeare came from nothing and wrote plays, and how dare you suggest that somebody else did it? You're a classist monster. Is the normal critique. You're a classist I can't tell you what goes on. My
I
father
looked at the comments on your fallacy YouTube video.
Right.
YouTube fallacy video. Like, wow, this is getting heated. I didn't realize.
Oh, that's nothing. That's nothing. I that is such low key stuff compared to what goes on with this.
Wow.
I don't engage. I don't know if you saw my replies. I don't engage with people. In the beginning, I did. In the beginning of this, I went onto this Facebook group. Okay, this was in the very beginning of my research. And I'm old fashioned. I don't believe this, but like you're saying, argument will answer it. So if I go into this group of people and I present some ideas and listen to their response, I'm going to get a better idea of what's going on. I went into this group. I had just every post I would make, I would have 3 or 4 responses within 5 or 10 seconds attacking.
Oh gosh.
Okay. And there would be threads upon threads and deep threads and rabbit holes. And, it was like this incredible conflagration, because these people didn't have people to fight with, right? Because nobody would go on their group to fight with them. And they wanted to fight. They wanted to argue. And I was naive. I thought that they cared about the answer. But I also wanted to test. Are these people would spend a lot of time on this, years on it. They're amateurs, but they're the amateur experts. Okay, so
expert amateurs.
Exactly. So something like this. I mean, the whole thing's such a mess. I can't tell you, because how people use authority on this game too. But these people were very serious about this, and I thought, well, they must have good answers. They must have good. I didn't think that. I thought maybe they might. Turned out they didn't. Turned out they didn't have good arguments. They didn't have good answers. They had a lot of bullying, a lot of nastiness. They repeated the same things over and over again. And they didn't really have an insight or an explanation to any serious critique. They just had the same apologetics. And that's why I call it apologetics, because it's really religious. It's really religious defense of religion rather than defense of history or the study of, sort of a scientific inquiry. It's religious for them. And once I saw what was going on there, that these people didn't really have good arguments, then I knew, okay, it's not like I'm completely off base here. Now my work begins. And that's the thing that people don't understand. They take a religious view about this. It's not a religious question. It's a factual question. And I'm going to do real research, and I'm going to do real research that anybody would classify as real research, and we'll see what happens, right? So, they want to stop the research. They want to say that this isn't even a question. You're not allowed to research it. And traditional scholars are not permitted to study this topic. They're not permitted to even discuss this topic. Literally, it would be professional suicide to even mention this topic. If you're a professor of Shakespeare studies or a graduate student, you cannot even voice anything doubting Shakespeare at all. It's completely forbidden. So it has to be outsiders like me. It has to be amateurs doing the research, because the people in academia won't touch it. And so, but it's not a religion for me, right?
Right. There's some interesting parallels, if I might interrupt you, that are like popping up in my head. And this is it's epiphanies are happening right now. That, I mean, first of all, with specifically with your research, this is really interesting. And I'm glad that some gear is turning, even if it's turning slowly. But then I think what you're saying, if you weren't even speaking about Shakespeare, you can apply it to so many things. Of course, obviously, right now I'm thinking about how I live in, the desert, the sticks of Arizona. And
Right.
whenever I go into town, the people I encounter are very single-minded, and don't want to hear criticisms because they've been entrenched in certain ways for so long, and even and their beliefs are so religious,
Right.
literally like dealing with God, but in this kind of unquestioned devotional type way. And it's very dangerous, whether you're talking about Shakespeare or American politics or a personal health and wellness. If we are so devoted to a way that we think and believe is right, that we can't criticize that we can't be critical of that way, then we might be stuck doing the wrong things for a very long time.
Yes. And you have to give people some you have to realize that they're under huge social pressure, right?
Yeah.
So there's a huge social pressure to conform.
Yeah.
If everybody in your neighborhood has a certain view,
Mm-hmm.
can you step outside that, even
Right.
privately? And what are the consequences for this?
What are the consequences for that?
Right. And this happens, I mean, in people with strong religious backgrounds,
Mm-hmm.
it's the same thing. If you're brought up in a certain religious faith and you want to exit that faith or take a slightly different view of that, what are the consequences? And maybe
Right.
you're married to somebody based on that faith, and that's a core of your relationship.
Right.
If you have a change of view, or you have children, or whatever it is, what are the
Mm-hmm.
consequences?
They're very real consequences. I mean,
Right.
talking about financial support, emotional support, just social, knowing who we are, being confidence. I mean, go to Maslow's hierarchy, and that bottom level might drop out.
Right.
Depending
And it's
on
the same thing for the Shakespeare stuff. It's bizarre, but it's true. So
Mm-hmm.
let's say you're a rising graduate student studying Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
And in your careful research, you've determined that you think that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. You think somebody else. That's what you study the Italian sources of Shakespeare, and you study and you say, well, the author must have been able to read Italian, and you just affirm on this because these 20 reasons, the author must have been able to read Italian, and there's no evidence that Shakespeare could read Italian, so maybe somebody, and that's your view, maybe somebody else read it. Your career is over if you voice that view. And it's a silly thing. Who cares? I mean, I think it's a silly thing who wrote the works of Shakespeare. What does it matter, right?
Right.
But if you think people are faced with these kinds of problems in their real life, in things, religion or politics, or their own view of themselves or their own identity,
Yeah.
and they need to squash it, push it down.
Yeah.
It's like the Book of Mormon musical, push it down, right? You got to push it down, whatever it is. Better hide that, right? Yeah. And it's like, how, can you keep it down long enough? Can you keep it down, right? And people are faced with these things every day, and if people were more open to open inquiry and discussion, it might be better. But I don't think that's it. I mean, it would be better. You're a little more optimistic, I think, than me. It'd be better, but I'm not the optimist. I mean,